Jesse, thank you so much for making time to speak with me in the BCIT alumni community today. My name is Allie Siemens, and I am the Alumni Relations Manager at BCIT. I want to start by acknowledging that I, as well as the 5 BCIT campuses, are located on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am so grateful to occupy this space and this land. To provide some context to the people who will tune in later, the BCIT Alumni Association has an online book club, and your book, Jesse, From the Ashes, was selected by alumni readers to engage with. I want to start by giving the audience members an overview of your well-deserved accolades. Jesse Thistle's award-winning memoir, From the Ashes, was a #1 national bestseller and the best-selling book of 2020 by a Canadian author and has remained atop bestseller lists since it was published. From the Ashes was a CBC Canada Reads finalist, an Indigo Best Book of 2019, and the winner of Kobo Emerging Writer Prize Nonfiction, an Indigenous Voices Award, and High Plains Book Award. Jesse Thistle is Métis Cree and an assistant professor at York University in Toronto. He is a PhD candidate in the history program at York, where he is working on theories of intergenerational and historic trauma of the Métis people. Jesse has won the P.E. Trudeau and Vanier doctoral scholarships, and he is a Governor General medalist. Jesse is the author of The Definition of Indigenous Homelessness in Canada, published through the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and his historical research has been published in numerous academic journals, book chapters, and featured on CBC Ideas, CBC Campus, and Unreserved. A frequent keynote speaker, Jesse lives in Hamilton with his wife Lucy and is at work on multiple projects, including his next book. So Jesse, it is an honor to introduce you today, and I ultimately want to start by asking you, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm excited to be talking to you. So thank you again for making the time.
Yeah, no worries. It's nice to talk to you too, Allie.
Thank you. You know, I took some time to of course, read the book From the Ashes, but also listen to a few of your other interviews. And in some of your interviews, you've touched on identifying as a storyteller. And storytelling is such a big part of our work in education. And I want you to tell me why story is important to you.
Story helped me get better in a lot of ways. Story is, I actually believe in narrative therapy and sharing who we are with people. It creates a bridge of understanding where there's universal truths in all of our lives, right? And if we tell our truths in a way that's, unabashedly honest, with our ugly and our beautiful, then others can see themselves in your story and they can understand. And there's like a fellowship that happens from that. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a healing thing. Yeah. There's actually a little narrative therapy that I took when I was in rehab and that I continue to do today to heal from trauma. And so it's actually part of my program to get better, to share. And so I always make time to share stories and listen to the stories of others as well.
That's beautiful. And I think it's such an important part of who we are as people, but also in the world that I think both of us are working in education. So you touched on why story is important and how it is healing. And what does being a storyteller mean to you?
Uh, Being a storyteller is I would say it's like we're like knowledge carriers. We disseminate through story, right? And this encompasses my work in history as well. This is not just my literary work. And so there's a lived experience storytelling that I did with my memoir. And then there's like retrieval of historic narrative from my people. And if you look at the work of like Linda Smith, she's a Maori scholar, remembering the corpus or the body of our people is literally remembering, putting the arms back on, putting the legs back on, reconstituting our people. And so there's that aspect of storytelling too, right? And embedded with everything that I share are cultural teachings that I've learned along the way. Some of them I learned on the streets. Others I learned from my elders, and others I learned from, my partner Lucy, or even the animals and nature around me. And so I think it's all these things mixed together make like a really uh, tasty cake of story.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, you touched on that of course, in your journey, and I think that's a really beautiful segue into just the resilience that you've demonstrated. And, perhaps in the world that we're currently in 2021, and the year that we've had, resilience is such an important topic, but something that we're all talking about. So you've demonstrated resilience in the very aspect of the definition. Where do you believe that you inherited that resiliency?
I would say my ancestors were more resilient than me. They've struggled far more. My ancestors along the road allowance, total marginalization by the government, stripped us of our lands, of any support, lack of access to education. My mom lived through that, and she's still pretty damaged. And she's I would say, a lot more resilient than I am.
Mm,
And my Gaelic ancestors from Scotland that were displaced from their Highland homes and shipped off to Cape Breton and then forgot about. They were resilient as well. And my ancestors in around Temiskaming that were absorbed into the body politic violently by the Canadian state. And so, yeah, I would say that they're resilient. I look at myself as more lucky. I don't see myself as resilient. It's like when a plane crashes, right? And you're the lone survivor and you walk away. That's basically what happened with me in my life. I'm among all my peers that were on the streets with me, or in the jail system, or in rehab. Most of them are dead right now. And so I can't really take credit for that. It was just the way that the systems aligned. It was kind of luck. And so for me, I feel like, yeah, I'm more lucky than my ancestors, and maybe they were more resilient people than me. So.
that resiliency, though, that's important to acknowledge in our ancestors, and especially the stories that you've carried forward from them. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I connected with a few folks across the institute here at BCIT, and one colleague, Zah Joseph, who is an advisor within BCIT's Indigenous initiatives and partnerships. And you talked about when you returned to school, the community that you had around you. And so Zah, he notes that many Indigenous students have a fear in self-identifying as Métis, First Nations, or Inuit in the post-secondary systems. And I think the first question is, did you have the same fear?
Yeah, yes, I did. Yeah, because it pegs you, right? It pegs you as the other, right? This and Western institutions, particularly post-secondary, can be violent spaces, or historically were violent spaces. Research on it was extractive on our people. They weren't welcoming spaces, and for a long time we weren't wanted there. And so that carries over. And then that's from the institutional part of it. And then you get the student body that have internalized or feel the racism that pervades our society about Indigenous peoples. So in a lot of ways, it's a black mark, you know?
Yeah.
That's how I felt originally. And then beyond that, if you look at like the politics of identity, especially now in the last 10 years, there's like it's just really nasty, ugly stuff of who's the most authentic Indigenous, who can prove that they have this and this and this, and they have the more right to this or that. And so literally, I know people that are trying to reclaim and fit in, but they're afraid because of the cultural police that exists now.
Mm,
That there's the pretend Indian list online, right? Like, what does that do for displaced adoptees who don't know who they are and can't track their records? All this infighting that's among really middle class elites. What does that do for the students that are coming in trying to find themselves? It makes them afraid to claim who they are, and that's a real tragedy. That's why I never ever participate in that, because I remember the anxiety and fear that I felt when I was first looking for my ancestral record, going through genealogy workshops, looking at historical texts, trying to figure out who I was. And so we're in a great time where some Indigenous youth are connecting and finding themselves, but then there's like this handful that are afraid because of the climate and because of the university and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to think about some of the learnings that I've been privileged to acknowledge, and just that education is what got us into this mess. A lot of, in going back to the beginning, and kind of piggybacking off of Za's question, is I guess a follow up. And how would you recommend students open up about their identity and feel proud of who they are in this system?
Well, I would say find your people, right? And what I mean by that is like find where they're in most post-secondary university spaces and college spaces. There are designated areas for community. At York University, you have what's called CAS, the Center for Aboriginal Student Services. I'm sure you guys have something like that on campuses, and
Yes.
so go there, connect with the people. If you have like an on-site powwow, go to powwow. you know Enjoy your community, get to know, have friends, find your Indigenous guidance counselor that can help you. And don't be afraid, right? I know that, like, you made a great point there. These educational systems were set up, residential schools, day schools, all that, and education was used as a way to condition out our indigeneity,
Mhm.
where now we're in the modern era. That's kind of reversed. These post-secondary institutions are re-indigenizing us in a lot of ways. We're connecting with our identities. And we do that through finding community within the institution. So find a mentor, find a guidance counselor, find your friends, who are Indigenous, and really, because that saved me. That's how I really connected and found a home in academia, was through my community at CAS. Yeah.
Well, you're setting me up for a really good flow here, because my next question is regarding community specifically. And you acknowledge this in your memoir as how community, surrounds us at different points in our lives. So, can you share with me what community means to you?
What community means? Reciprocal responsibility. That's what community means. That's what actually being Indigenous is. It's like, who are your people? And then how do you contribute in a good way to those people? It's not extractive. You don't just go there and take. You can take, but what are you putting back? How are you enriching the lives of the people that are helping you? You know, what is your research actually doing? What is your studies actually doing? How are they helping your people? And so that's fundamental to everything about being Indigenous in the academy and outside of that. And I learned that through reconnection with my family out west. I learned what community is. I learned what it is to be Indigenous, to help my elders, take them to bingo, plant their gardens, fix their porch, fix their roofs. This is what it is. And I'm actually researching. This is a legitimate methodology to work with our communities, because wherever I go, I have to leave it better than I encountered it. And that's what being an Indigenous community member is about.
Okay, I'd love to touch on that a bit more, because reciprocity is such a beautiful lesson that I think, we teach to our kids, and we continue to teach our youth, and it's something we constantly learn as adults, right? That give and that take. So how do we do better in shaping our communities?
That's a tough question. How do we do better? I think we just bring our best selves, and where we see youth or people coming in where we once were, we try to pay it forward and help them like people once had helped us. And so that's important, right? As you progress, on the, I guess, chart of being in community, you have to return that. It's not necessarily reciprocal to the person that helped you, but the broader community. And so that's how we will improve our community. And I'm a big advocate for creating community in universities. And so this means hiring faculty that can do that. to create critical mass, to create that community where they're starting to pay it forward to all the different students that come under their purvey, and they share their knowledge, and hopefully that will continue, and that'll create like critical mass within the university setting. So that's what I believe.
No, it's a good way of tying it all together. And I know we talk about our alumni community and bringing them back for mentorship opportunities with students, and that reciprocity, as you say, it's not necessarily to the person who always helped you, but making making bigger moves.
Yeah, yeah. You want to start that grass fire, right? You want to like light it up, and I know that's a weird analogy, but you know what I mean. It has to, like, it's a chain reaction. And I don't mean just mentors for alumni. I mean like hiring faculty and paying them well so that you can retain them. Because a lot of post-secondary places try to bring in faculty and they can't retain them because somewhere else pays them better. So pay them well, and that will create critical mass and community in the institutional setting.
Absolutely. A fantastic call to action.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Jesse, can you share with me the importance of reconnecting with your Indigenous heritage and what that means to you today?
Means everything. I don't know, and I don't mean that lightly. I really do mean that. So if you read my book, which you have, a lot of people have misread my book and think that the homelessness that I talk about is the homelessness that starts when I'm 20 and I get kicked out of my grandparents' house when I get caught with the drugs. That's not when the homelessness starts in the book. The homelessness starts when I'm taken from the road allowance at 3 years old. It's a cultural homelessness. It's a spiritual homelessness. It's a disconnection from my kin networks, from my connection to land and my teachings as a Métis Cree person. And the rest of my life, I'm trying to figure myself out. I'm trying to learn how to love and trust, trying to find out what it doesn't mean to be quote unquote Indian. And, I make a lot of bad choices because of that. I admit that. And I eventually end up houseless. I get kicked out. And it's not until way later through education that I start to say, hey, the key to me understanding why I became homeless and houseless is tied up with me not knowing who I am as a dislocated, adopted Métis person. And so when I get back into my studies and I start to dig through the records and I look at my family tree, I'm dispelling a lot of those internal stereotypes that I lived out because that's what popular culture taught me, right? Alcoholic, criminal, on the streets, homeless. These are all stereotypes, right? This is taught to Indigenous people through popular culture. So no wonder I became that, because that's what I picked up. And it wasn't until I got to university and I looked at my family history and I'm like, wait a minute, we were not drunks or alcoholics or criminals. We were proud Métis resistance fighters that stood up for our land and our people, and that's really cool, you know.
It is.
And the fact that we were disempowered and everything was taken from us, and that's why things happened, because there was a lot of stress and intergenerational trauma. That's completely different. That's actually the reverse. We became those things because our indigeneity and everything was stripped away from us. And so when I got back to university and I learned about this, about my culture, it kind of like helped with my addiction, and it gave me all my answers to my family and myself. I
Mm.
had the answers as to why things were the way they were. And I felt for the first time in my life truly home, truly like I belonged somewhere, and that I had value. And it dispelled all those stereotypes that I was taught. And I know who I actually am now. That's a powerful thing, right? Imagine going your whole life not knowing who you are and finding that in university. And so that's what happened to me. And I try to share that as much as I can. That's my way to pay it forward. So when I see other students like I was, I try to walk them through the same process of reconnection that Dr. Badruchny and Carol and Dr. Freeman did with me. So
Thank you. I I want to, near the beginning of your answer there, you talked about how people have interpreted your book and at what point the reader had maybe said, this is when Jesse was homeless. And I appreciate that, um, really like a poetic but also very honest response as to like, no, it started way earlier than maybe when you read in the book. So maybe as a last question, or if I can phrase it as such, but like what do you wish people would ask you, or what do you feel is the missing point in when people read your memoir? Is there a message you were hoping people take?
The book is actually a narrative of love. It's a story of love, and people sometimes miss that. And when I mean love, I'm not talking about eros. I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm talking about like community love, love of self, love of creator, love of the land. That is the thread that runs through the whole book. And if you look, when I'm taken and I first become homeless, culturally homeless when I'm 3, I also lose the ability to love and trust because your mom and your dad are who teaches you people that, right? It's been like this since the beginning of time. And so and then when I get to my grandparents' house, their hearts are broken because my father was taken from them. And so they tried to love me, but they were broken in their own way. You know, my grandfather was a disciplinarian. My grandmother had issues because her firstborn son went missing. And then when I finally come into contact with real love when I'm a young man, I do what any cowardly young man does that's afraid of love. I sabotage it and run away. You know, I broke her heart. And for the rest of the book, I'm trying to find love, and I do find it in different places. When I'm stealing from the Chinese food place, the owner, instead of arresting me, she shows me camaraderie love. She's like, okay, I'm going to teach you a lesson about kindness and that you're actually stealing from good people. And she did that by giving me the ground beef, and that changed my heart. That was the first time in my life that I realized I'm stealing from good people. They're not faceless, you know? That did more than jail ever or the police ever. All that contact that I had, that changed me. Then I got to Harvest House and I saw that these people loved me, Dr. Terry, and they wanted to help me and do my best. You know, my cellmates that helped me learn to read and write. These are all forms of love. And I got lessons in jail from like criminals that people wouldn't think are capable of that kind of like deep human love. And then finally, at the end of me getting better, I find the love of my life, Lucy. And that creates a bridge for me out of the loveless life that I was living into, I guess, normality or the life that I'm living now. And so that thread is actually the arc of the story. And people sometimes they're not understanding that for some reason.
Mm.
Lori, my editor, and me very clearly, and some readers do, but most miss that thread for some reason. And I want that clear that that's what the story is actually about.
Yeah, that arc of love is so important. And I mean, not to be cheesy or wrap a bow on it, but I think it is that feeling of love conquers all, and that reminder to be soft on people, hard on systems. And that's not my language. I'm borrowing that from many other smart people, but
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's another thread that I wish people would really pick up on. Like, if you look at all the different broken systems that impacted me along the way, the story is actually a critique of all the different broken systems. So, child services. Why did they call my white grandparents? Why didn't they just call my mom? Because they were racist. Those they have that tendency. And so, because they don't talk about it explicitly, people don't make that connection. That's what a scoop looks like from a child's perspective. Then, when I get to the education system, instead of looking at me as a traumatized Native kid that's gone through a lot, they failed me in grade 2. And I have a problem with literacy the rest of my life, right? All the way through. Then, if you look at when I bring um, evidence for 2 guys that did something horrible, they murdered someone, I'm treated like the suspect. If I was a white dude, they would have looked at me a completely different way. Then you look at the way that the hospital system treated me, and I almost lost my leg. This is what happens to Indigenous people when they try to get help in these systems. And so the whole book, actually, if you break it down, is a critique of all the different systems that almost ultimately took my life. And, so yeah.
absolutely. I know we're rounding out the time that we have here together, and I ultimately, I want to provide you with the platform for a call to action, because I think we sit with this audience of people who are change makers and innovators, and um, what's your call to action, Jesse? What can people do to acknowledge the love, but also make change in our community?
What I really honestly think, I think that we, as Indigenous creatives, people, I wish people would see us as we are in modernity. We're not given that latitude. We're always, and I see it a lot with like other creatives. They have to perform a certain kind of indigeneity, and I don't think that that's an accurate portrayal of how we actually live in the world today, and that's actually doing us a disservice, because we're still the other when we're performing that way. You know, we're just like regular people. So support art, support creatives, support. Indigenous people that are just expressing themselves as they are in modernity. And I think that would do a lot to make us feel welcome and give us a spot where we rightfully belong with everyone else. You know, we're not in. We shouldn't be put in glass cases and have to perform our indigeneity all the time.
Thank you. It's
You're
a
welcome.
it's a really it's tangible, right? Those are good. Those are examples of things that people can do, and I know that there's a ton of work that we need to do in reconciliation, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to outline a few things that folks can do to just assist in being better to our Indigenous peoples here in Canada.
Yeah, yeah. And, last comment on that last
Yeah.
thing is like when people read my book, I get it in Goodreads, and I get people emailing me all the time. They're like, I picked this book up because I thought it was a book about Indigenous people, and there's no Indigenous stuff in there. What they're really meaning, these are, people that want to see a performance. They want me to put on my buckskins and my beads and my feathers and all that stuff. And I'm just talking about the lived experience of an Indigenous person in the 1980s as it was. And like I was dislocated, so that wasn't part of my indigeneity. But if you look at the way that the systems are impacting me, the way I was scooped, the way that like I was suffering from trauma, all those things, that is the lived experience of an Indigenous person from the 80s and 90s. And so I don't want to say to that person, you're kind of being a little racist by saying that there's no Indigenous content, because the whole book is about an Indigenous family, my own. So how can it not be Indigenous content? And so that's what I mean. We got to support books and content like that.
Yeah, such a beautiful reminder that lived experiences cannot be argued with, and to honor them when they're being shared as they're being presented.
Yeah, yeah, and we can't judge or compare. You can't say one is more better than the other. Or just they're all equal, and we all need to share our stories because we are all fragments of stories. And the more that we pull them together, the more coherent the narrative of our peoples comes. And this is ultimately what we have to do: reconstitute our kin networks, our people, and our nations. And I strongly believe that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jesse Thistle, the storyteller, Métis Cree man, who is really making beautiful change in a community that, I'm just really, really humbled to have you share your story.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to talk with you all today.